Thank you. So, just like Muffy, I'd like to thank Kate and the team for creating this amazing event. I think we were both blown away by the variation of activities going on, and it sort of all happened very quietly. I didn't really know much about that aspect. As Kate says, I have been helping in other ways, but I hope I know something of your lot, as it were, having worked with teachers for 6 or 7 years now in different ways, and myself having struggled with the teaching of programming. I don't say struggled, I mean I've sort of enjoyed the adventure over the last about 15 years of teaching programming. So, and I think the issues that we face in universities teaching programming, which is mostly where I've come across the issues, are much the same as you all face teaching 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. Although this says too much doing, not enough understanding, I've actually packed a lot more in. So I'm sorry if there's too many slides here. We'll see how it goes. But I'm just so excited to talk about some aspects of what is coming up in the academic community about the pedagogy of programming. And I think, you know, my understanding talking to CAS people is that there are many teachers out there who will basically be scared by Muffy's message. Muffy's message is computational thinking is about programming. And I think there are many teachers, you know, me along the way at times as well, who've gone, well, my God, teaching programming is just so dang hard. You know, and so I think there's some nervousness about the message and the fact that the new SQA qualifications promote programming much more strongly. But I also want to say I think there's a massive amount of light coming in at not the end of the tunnel. You know, we're near the end of the tunnel. There's lots of light about what the issues are and what we can do. So why isn't this doing anything? Do I have to press that go button? Technology.
I didn't dare use that. Okay.
No, I'm clearly not getting anywhere with the arrows. I'm busily controlling them. I'm controlling the PC. Muffy's talk is busily doing things over here, so I'll just press this little button. Okay, so I think there are some core issues worth us looking at. Fundamental question: is programming learnable by all? And what is our approach? What do we think? Do we think programming is something that's learnable by all? What about the pedagogies that we use to try and teach programming? Are they actually fit for purpose? Are they things that we picked up 10, 15 years ago? Is there more out there now that we could be using and building on? And I want to talk particularly about learning to program as an apprenticeship and how we can match, you know, industrial teaching of large numbers of pupils, learners, children, whatever, with an apprenticeship model which is usually thought of in quite a different way. So the first part I want to talk about is the attitude to learning, of course in computer science, but generally there's been a lot of research work. And in a way what I want to highlight in this talk is a whole number of papers that are worth reading. And I've put a whole list on the end of the talk of about 20 papers that I think are all fascinating for our subject. So I'm just, in a way, this is just dotting through a bunch of those papers. Anyway, this woman, Carol Dweck, has researched for about 20 years attitudes to learning. What do we believe about our ability to learn? What does a pupil believe about their ability to learn? And she very much says that some people just believe there are things they can't learn. So you know how we say, oh, I can't do music. You know, I just can't do music. Or I can't do maths. You know, she would think of that as a mindset, which is a complete block. Whether they could or not, they don't believe they can. And so she's done lots of work on this, and actually what it really comes out as is that, well, yes, there is a certain innate ability for things. So there's some truth in the idea that I'm a natural at music. There's some truth in that, or I'm a natural for programming, or whatever it might be. But she finds there's an unknown potential for growth. So there's an unknown potential for how much we can actually learn and grow if we could just shift our attitude towards our ability to learn that stuff. She showed it's quite easy to switch between the two mindsets. Now what's worrying about that is we can easily switch somebody with a growth mindset to a fixed mindset. But let's look at the good news. We can also switch them the other way quite easily too. So it's a positive and negative message, that one. There are a lot of consequences of this simple idea, which I certainly don't have time to talk about now, but one of the most crucial ones is that they did research into managers, and they found that managers with a fixed mindset did not bother to mentor their staff. Because if the managers had a fixed mindset, their attitude to learning was you can either do it or you can't. So why bother to mentor my staff? If I can see they can do it, they're doing well. If they can't, they can't. And obviously that's a concern for us as teachers, because we're a bit like that. We're potentially the mentors of our students. If we fundamentally believe you can't learn this subject and the student in front of me is not getting it, I'm not going to bother to put the effort in. That's a horrible thing to think, but even I catch myself like that sometimes. Even though I know all this research. So I think it's something for us to think about is what do I really believe about somebody's ability to learn, for example, programming. I wonder if there's something about teaching computer science that fosters this fixed mindset. So there's lots of research you can look at here. We did a study in Glasgow University by trying to convert people's attitudes to learning from fixed to growth. We got a 10% improvement in grades. Now, I'm not saying that's the best study in the world, but I mean, nonetheless, that's still an interesting result. Piaget talked about stages of learning, and there's more work going on that which suggests that perhaps we assume our pupils, our learners, know too much to start with. And perhaps if we actually unpick it and work out what the earlier stages are, that we just assume, because we're computational thinkers. So we assume things that actually our learners don't have. And that could be a cause of quick failure. And as I don't have time to talk about all of these, but this is all very interesting research looking at issues that might be causing students not to do as well in our subject as we would hope. So really, the takeaway from that is there is increasing evidence out there that in fact programming is learnable by all, and we just haven't quite worked out how to teach it yet, but we're getting there. That's the important message. There's lots coming out that we could look at that will help us, I think, do a better job. Okay, how many of you remember this program? Or this one? It depends what age group you are. If you're a bit older, you remember Brucey, and if you're a little bit younger, you might remember Larry Grayson. Anyway, so this is of course Bruce Forsyth's generation game. So what happened? What were those people doing in these activities here? So if you remember this, you usually get a generational team, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, or something like that. They had some complex skill that was demonstrated to them pretty darn briefly. The contestant was then left to have a minute to get on with it on their own, and the final product was usually a terrible mess, wasn't it? We all remember that very clearly. So let's have a look at it. Does this sound at all familiar? Okay, so the complex skill is programming. We do a little bit of a lecture, perhaps a book, give them a video, a little lesson. We set them straight to problem solving. There's not usually very many simpler stage tasks because we don't know what they are, and all too often the final product is a terrible mess. So I think this is just to highlight that now this is particularly, I think, a university problem. I don't know if it's such a school problem, but I think that we set them to problem solving far too early. They don't understand the foundational stuff yet, and we haven't learned very well how to get that foundational stuff in there. And the research shows, this was an absolute eye-opening paper for me, Kirshner, Sweller and Clark, basically saying minimal guidance methods of teaching don't work. So the idea, which is very prevalent and appears every decade or so under a different guise, problem-based learning is one of the most recent, that if you just set people at problems, they'll work it out and they'll learn your subject. And this is a very convincing argument to me, scientifically based, as to why that's rubbish. And that we actually, here it is, I haven't got time to talk about it all, but they claim that really worked examples are the way to go. That's really their deliverable. But we can play with this idea as well, and I'll talk about more later in the talk. So my second big kind of message is perhaps we moved to problem solving too soon, and we haven't got the foundations in place. Now, something else is we have a set of high aspirational outcomes for our programming students. We want them to understand the concepts deeply. We don't really want them just to understand one language. We want them to understand about the concepts so they can go on and use other languages and systems and be computational thinkers. That's what we're really about. For this lifelong involvement that Muffy was talking about. Now, so that's one premise. I think we can all accept that one. So we can put a tick next to that, smiley face. The second premise is that we often assess a programmer's understanding by measuring the quality of the artifacts they produce. Therefore, we must assume that the ability to deliver a working program is in some sense a measure of what the student actually understands in this deep way that we want them to understand. So I'm really quite unhappy with that as an assessment strategy. So who actually produced the artifact? That's the important question. It may be the learner. And if the learner really did produce the whole artifact all on their own, well, that's great. Maybe our assumption is correct, that they actually do understand the subject deeply. But how many of your students have you seen just hacking it around? Quite a few hands, I think. And we see it in the university as well. You know, they just bodge it until something works, and they think that because the program is working, they've achieved a task. They've achieved the learning outcome. But that's not the learning outcome. It's just getting something working is not it. It's about deep understanding. That's what we care about. Worse, they might have got it all off the web or off their friends. I mean, we're the best will in the world. We as tutors want our students to succeed. And we mistakenly think of getting a program working as a success. But that's not it. Okay, so I think this is an important one for us to consider. We use a potentially invalid assessment mechanism when we think of working programs as the outcome. And even if we don't believe it, it is unbelievable how strongly our students believe it, is what I discovered. And that's not understanding, that's just, you know, monkeys and typewriters. So what about an alternative model? And I think apprenticeship is a very good model, and I didn't really know about this until I think it was Peter Donaldson said to me recently about Tom Conlon in Edinburgh and actually using cognitive apprenticeship right through that teacher training process. So those of you who I don't know if Glasgow does that or Strathclyde, or I have no idea, but I just heard recently that he was very hot on that, and I think that's really exciting. So let's think of apprenticeship as something like a tailor. So here's a tailory. I don't know what it's called. A sweatshop, perhaps. I'm not sure. Anyway, and you can see here's the boss. He's a proud man. You know, he's in charge of all these people. He's a master of his trade. And many of these people here will actually be masters, and there'll just be a few beginners, just a small number of beginners in there. And what happens in an apprenticeship? Well, to start off with, you do easy but meaningful tasks. So here's somebody just doing some ironing. You know, but they're in the milieu, they're picking up what it is to be a tailor, they're listening to the conversations. And so, you know, just observation and acculturation going on in doing that. They're given smaller tasks as they're learning, so they're not given a whole suit to make, like our whole problem to solve. They're just given a little buttonhole, or a bit of cutting, or just a bit of hemming, or just some little thing to do, which set the skills in place, the foundational skills in place. And the master is continually watching, or not just the master, but all of the masters in here are watching and making sure that things are being done well, looking at the quality, observing the process of how the thing is being put together. And subtle knowledge, the knowledge that we can't really teach, that's why this works. Because how could you teach somebody to make a perfect suit? You can't teach that, can you? You get it by skill over time. So the subtle knowledge necessary for these very high-skilled tasks is assimilated slowly. So for us, if we think of programming as an apprenticeship task, well, could we perhaps emphasise reading and explanation over writing? Could we actually have some processes that are a little bit more peripheral to the actual process of writing programs, but you know, with other people maybe? I mean, I'm not quite sure how to get this one in place, but something, yeah, this might be some way towards it. Do we even know what the small tasks are really accurately, the small processes that we use in programming that we can actually drill our students with? Can we actually capture the process as it's going along? So I was objecting to the idea that we look at the result, we look at the working program. But how could we actually capture the process the student is using as they go through and give them feedback on that? I mean, very difficult in a large classroom, but what could we do there? You know, we really need a truly progressive curriculum that is building up this subtle knowledge, because it's just as difficult to program well as it is to make the suit well. And we can't teach it, as you know. I can't just let you know. You can't just let your pupils know how to program. It's developed over time. So I kind of like this apprenticeship model, and one of the things that the cognitive apprenticeship people talk about is tools, activities and culture. And we can quite easily teach students tools and activities. It's like, you know, how do the various constructs of the language work? How does a programming environment work? We can do that easily enough. We can even give them an insight into the little activities, such as compiling and running your program and making a little edit and so on. But it's the culture of the expert that we're trying to foster. So think of the culture of a novice programmer when their program doesn't work. They run it. It doesn't work. They bring up the editor. They make a random change. That's all part of the activities and the tools, and then they run it again, and it doesn't work, and they make a random change. You've all seen it. That's the novice culture. The expert culture is to get the editor up when your program doesn't work, really analyse the program closely, see if you can formulate a hypothesis as to why it's not working, set up some test data that accurately checks your hypothesis. If it comes out right, then you fix your program, blah, blah, blah. There's a completely different culture. And it's like Muffy was saying about computational thinking. It's like, it's an acculturation into the way of thinking that we're trying to get across. The way computing folks see, understand, and solve problems. So I've had this slide for a while, and it was only when I saw Muffy's that I thought, ah, here's an overarching definition of computational thinking. It's this, the way computing folks see all this stuff. Right, so how do you do this in an industrial teaching setting such as we're all in? You've got it bad enough. It's pretty bad in universities with classes of 200 as well. So one way I think is definitely about engaging students in questioning and discussion. Can they explain their understanding to each other and to you? Give them practice in articulating their understanding, because if they can't talk about it, as far as I'm concerned, they don't understand it. So there are a number of relevant pedagogies, I think, around this, broadly in this kind of flipped teaching model. Get the students to do something on their own first and then have class discussions about it, perhaps prompted with questioning. So the one I particularly know about is peer instruction, and we've done this with vast numbers of students in America and in my own classes here. And broadly speaking, just very quickly, the peer instruction idea is that they do something beforehand on their own, they get some initial understanding of what's going on. It may be wrong, it may be faulty, but they get something in their head. And then in class, you basically ask them questions, they vote on it with some kind of voting system, however that might work, and then you get them discussing in fixed groups, and they're trying to argue why their answer was the right one. So they're having to dredge down to the understanding they have and actually explain why they think what they're saying is correct. Eventually that group votes again, and then you can lead off a class-wide discussion. And the great thing about this is that there's a priming going on, so that even if the whole class doesn't understand this point, after we've had this discussion and people from the class have given ideas and talked about it in their own words, they're primed for the instructor, the teacher, to talk about it in their expert modelling of it, and they're all primed to understand it. They're ready. They've all engaged with this problem for the last 10 minutes. So it seems to be quite effective. What about the small tasks? You know, what are the buttonholes, the cutting, the hemming of programming? What are these small tasks? So I've got a little bit of an insight into this, and I think this is work in progress. We looked at the 133 questions that we created for that course in America, and we analysed them to look at what it was we were asking, because we found in that course it was very successful. It really seemed to deliver computational thinking skills. So why was that? What had these questions done? And just in very, very brief, what we found is a kind of taxonomy came out. So fairly obviously, we were addressing the different programming concepts. I mean, you can't ask very much in one little multiple choice question. So already we were getting down to small things. So the key is, what were the small things about? Well, obviously the different concepts that we were trying to teach. But what was more interesting was that these questions nearly always crossed what we talk about as abstraction levels. I don't think this is quite the right term yet, but what I mean by this is there's the problem written in English, there's the way we think about it as computer scientists in the kind of speak we can use, like, well, it's going to need a loop, but I'll need a couple of variables here, and I'll do this first and that second. And it's the kind of language we know about, and so we call it CS speak, because it's not something the common person would use, but it's something that we can as computational thinkers. And then the bottom level is, well, let's translate that thinking into some code. So what we found was that these questions nearly always transitioned across these levels. Sometimes, I mean, the obvious one we all know about is, here's the problem in English, give me some code. But we've missed out a step. What about little questions to say, here's a problem in English, well, how are you going to think about that? You know, and equally important, because I think it's crucial for debugging, is to be able to go from code and go back upwards. Now let me look at this code, what's it really doing? You know, what's the computational idea in here? Have I got it right? Does it match up with my problem? And so on and so forth. So these transitions appear, all of these questions involve transitions virtually, not a whole lot, but most of them. Telling them about programming concepts appears to be quite easy. Doing this thing over here is much more difficult, but I think this is fundamental to programming. We do that all the time. We move between these transition levels. So I think this is one step forward on the what are the buttonholes, what's the hemming, what are the little tasks that we can get, how can we bring them forward slowly, step by step. And so, you know, I've just got a couple of example questions here. Here's a little one which is CS speak to code. Okay, so how would I write a relational operational expression that returns true when an igloo is blue? So this returns true when an igloo is blue. That's kind of the CS speak idea. How would I represent that? This is Alice, and so you have to pick one of these, and it gets you to think, well, A, you're seeing code, which is a good thing, and you're arguing and reasoning about the code as you go. Here's another one, which is English to CS speak. So we've got some customers waiting in a line, and you want to serve each customer one at a time. Basically, you know, each customer is going to walk forward to the counter and you're going to deal with them. So basically this is saying, well, what kind of computational construct do you need for this? So they're very simple questions, but you've got to get to the bottom of your understanding to explain what it is. So these are different kinds of looping constructs in Alice. Which one of these is it that you should pick? It turns out in this case it's a for all in order tile, because that takes the collection of customers and it processes them one at a time. If it was for all together, that would be parallel. But they've got to have that discussion to explain their understanding of these concepts in order to get the right answer. Okay, so I think there's and there's other people working in these areas to try and get at what these little pieces are. But I think that's something that we're working on. Okay, so just in the last few minutes, Scottish schools programming, what's happening here? Well, obviously we've got this new curriculum, some of us are scared, some of us are really excited, there's a whole blend there, but it's potentially really good for programming, because we've got in there, partially my fault I confess, there are really hard things that you've got to do, which is actually your students have to be able to explain the code. And that's one of the requirements in there. But I hope you can see we're getting at ways on how to do that. But if they can't explain the code, they don't know anything about programming. So we fail. So you know, it has to be in there. SQA have no prescribed language for all schools. I was talking to Derek Middleton the other day, and we weren't quite sure of the history, but we wondered whether there was an outcry when SQA sort of almost said it had to be COMAL. I don't know if is that sort of right? Is that yeah? So SQA have never gone back to the idea of a single language, is my understanding, which is why you guys are allowed to teach in whatever you like. And of course that's very curriculum for excellence. You know, you're the subject experts. You have ideas about how to teach well. You do it how you want to do it. But sadly, we've got to assess it at the end. And so we had this kind of conundrum talking earlier in the year, you know, and I was kind of saying, well, you've got to have code in the exam. If you don't have code in the exam, you can't reason about it. You can't get students to reason about it. You can't get them to explain their understanding. You must have code of some form in the exam. So that was the question. So it was either, well, we'll pick 5 exemplar languages and we'll make 5 papers that kind of cover all, shakes their heads, and they didn't like that idea at all. We didn't understand it. We offered that the universities would help write them and things, but I still didn't like that idea. So then we kind of said, well, what about having effectively a kind of a reference language, or one that would be used in exams? So Greg Michelson and Harriet Watt and me and David Bethune and Derek Middleton and Sarah have been going through this kind of iterative process over the last quite a few months now of putting together a pseudocode specification, but a formal specification. So it's not left in the heads of the SQA examiners and you kind of know it because you've seen so many papers that you roughly know what to expect kind of thing. It's actually a formal specification. And so SQA are going to be using a version of this in their exams in order that code could be presented. We like the name Haggis. SQA weren't quite so keen on it, but we like it because it's clearly Scottish and it was made here, and it's made from lots of bits. Because we've kind of taken bits from a number of languages. So it's actually Greg who comes up with these names. He thought of Haggis, and then he thought, well, if they don't like that, what about Tartan? Because that's sort of similar, isn't it? Made from bits and all that. Anyway. But it's a lovely language, and it's been a very interesting iterative process because we're trying to make it. This is not a language for computers to understand. It's a language for us to talk about programming and computation with. So we hope it's very, very easy for kids to pick up, and you won't have a serious difficulty going from whatever language you're teaching to showing the kids this language. I don't think it's quite out. Well, there seems to be some guerrilla versions of the specification floating around amongst teachers, but I think Greg and I will put a version of it up anyway pretty shortly. The other thing that we're doing is we've encouraged strongly that this idea of a taxonomy, those transitions between levels, that SQ actually use this in their exams, and Sarah was just saying to me that the question setters are taking this on really quite enthusiastically to actually have questions of this style in the exam, and so that kind of is a lead to you that we want to actually get the students thinking in that way across those transitions. Okay, so some suggestions to try. I actually put these together for new lecturers in universities, but I think it applies equally well in this, because we're all trying to do the same thing basically. So I think we should reduce the emphasis on problem solving early on. More worked examples, perhaps moving to faded worked examples, where you leave steps out and you get them to actually come up with what that step should be. So you're guiding them. I feel like I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs here. You guys know all about this. But particularly get them to articulate their understanding a lot. Now, I recently have changed from a laboratory model where there's kind of a small number of tutors, and I've actually engaged my final year students to come and act as tutors in the first year lab. So there's a much higher staff-student ratio. And they are really, really good at drawing the students' understanding out. And I just said to Susan, who we came across on the train with from Vale of Leven, I just said, is there any opportunity for getting your advanced higher students to come down into the earlier years and do the same thing? Into S3 or S2 or wherever, and say, look, explain what's going on there. Because I get that if there's one of you and 20 or 30 pupils, you've got a tall order. But if you can get one or two advanced higher students to come down, you've got a much better opportunity for discussion and to really get this kind of thing happening. And I really encourage you to flip your classroom. Whether you get the students to do the prep work in class or beforehand, get them doing the boring stuff that you would just be droning on at the front with, if you do that kind of thing. Lecturers do, obviously. So it's great for lecturers because you get them to read all the stuff before the class, and then in the class you have this fantastic animated discussion about what computation really is. Anyway, so flip your classroom, definitely. Okay, so summary. I think this is a fundamental starting point. Do we really believe that our students can learn to program? Do we really believe that we can teach them to program? Got to get that straight. Well, let's teach thinking skills and understanding. And this idea, the apprenticeship idea, well, what is it that we really do? How do we think and see problems? And I think this is the most exciting avenue opening up, is this one. And this is not a done deal yet. I think we'll learn more and more about this, about what the little pieces are that we need to help them with. Okay. Good.